When the government reopened weeks later, the BLS faced the enormous task of assessing how much had been lost. Their economists worked around the clock to reconstruct what they could, comparing vendor databases and supplementary datasets to fill missing prices. The agency eventually published a CPI release, but analysts quickly noted that the documentation surrounding it was unusually thin. There was little mention of how much of the data was estimated. Critics argued that the BLS should have been more transparent, perhaps including confidence intervals or separate notes indicating which price categories were most affected. Instead, the release presented a neat number. As always, leaving readers to wonder quietly about what lay beneath the surface. That lack of transparency created another layer of uncertainty: trust erosion. The United States has long been a global leader in statistical integrity. Investors around the world depend on U.S. economic data as a gold standard. When even small doubts arise about the accuracy or independence of those numbers, the shockwaves can be enormous. Foreign central banks, rating agencies, and multinational firms all rely on trusted data to make trillion-dollar decisions. A temporary disruption in the CPI may sound minor, but it undermines confidence in the entire machinery that keeps financial markets functioning. These data gaps also exposed a fairness problem. When official statistics falter, the most vulnerable households suffer most. Wealthier players in the economy, banks, hedge funds, consultancies can buffer uncertainty with private data sources. They buy access to credit card transaction datasets, satellite imagery of retail activity, and real-time rent tracking from commercial providers. Low-income families don't have that luxury. They rely on accurate public data to shape government benefits and wage negotiations. When the CPI goes astray, inequality quietly widens. There's another dimension to this story: the question of whether the BLS and similar agencies should be legally shielded from government shutdowns. Some economists argue that data collection is a form of critical infrastructure, as essential to the economy's stability as air traffic control or public safety services. They propose designating statistical agencies as essential operations, meaning they continue functioning even when political gridlock freezes the rest of government. Others suggest creating multi-year budget appropriations or a protected funding reserve to prevent future interruptions. The argument is straightforward. You can run a modern economy if you can measure it reliably. Technology might offer part of the solution too. The shutdown revealed how dependent the CPI process still is on manual collection. In an age where nearly every retail transaction is recorded digitally, some experts say the BLS should invest in automated systems that can capture real-time prices directly from point-of-sale systems or web data scraping. Of course, that raises other challenges: privacy, methodology, integration with traditional survey frameworks. But the world is changing fast, and the shutdown showed that resilience must include automation. For those inside the BLS, the episode was deeply frustrating. Many of them are career professionals who've spent decades perfecting the precision of economic measurement. They understood better than anyone how damaging those gaps would be. When they returned to work after the shutdown, they scrambled to repair datasets, update seasonal adjustments, and document missing cases. Some described it later as a heartbreaking experience, watching years of work undone by politics beyond their control. When people hear the phrase government shutdown, they often picture empty visitor centers or delayed passports. But the hidden cost: data blindness may last far longer. Economists call accurate, timely statistics a public good. They are invisible scaffolding holding up the markets, the Fed, and even policy debates. If those scaffolds weaken, everything built on top of them — interest rate policy, fiscal planning, consumer confidence — starts to wobble. By mid-2025, the aftershocks were still visible. Analysts compared the U.S. data integrity under the Biden shutdown to historical cases in other countries where government statistics faltered. They found that even temporary disruptions caused distortions lasting months. Revisions to inflation numbers continued throughout the year as new data arrived, meaning that past Fed decisions had been based on imperfect insights. It was a sobering reminder of how intertwined data and governance truly are. At the heart of this story lies a paradox. Modern economies depend on streams of perfect information, yet the production of that information rests on fragile institutions' staff, funding, politics. The Biden shutdown didn't just stop museums or close monuments. It stopped time in the statistical sense. For several critical weeks, the economy kept moving, but the instruments meant to measure it were frozen in silence. And that silence speaks volumes. It tells us how fragile our understanding of the economy really is, how dependent our confidence is on unseen workers gathering numbers in grocery aisles and apartment complexes. Without them, narratives of inflation rise. Policy debates harden into ideology, and the truth of what's really happening in people's lives becomes blurred. So the next time the monthly CPI report flashes across your screen sparking headlines, debates, and Wall Street reactions, remember this quiet chapter. Behind every figure there's a human system collecting, verifying, and protecting the cogs that keep the financial world turning. When that system breaks, as it did in early 2025, the consequences are profound. It's not just about politics or shutdowns. It's about the fragile architecture of knowledge that underpins capitalism itself. Without measurement, there is no management. And without data, there is no democracy of facts-only noise, speculation, and narrative. The Biden shutdown was a cautionary tale that the ability to know what's true about our economy can never be taken for granted. It must be defended, funded, and respected as one of the pillars of a functioning society. Because in the end, it's not the missing data that hurts most. It's the vacuum it leaves behind, where truth used to be. Let me give a concrete example. Imagine the BLS normally surveys a particular apartment complex in Phoenix in the first week of January, then another round in early February. If that January collection never happens, February's data no longer fits perfectly in sequence. Over time, that missing data point means the BLS has to use statistical methods estimation models called imputations to fill in the missing number. But imputation assumes that the missing data behaves like the observed data nearby. And that assumption can be dangerously false during turbulent times like winter price spikes in food or energy. Suppose, for instance, that during those weeks of the shutdown, a severe cold wave hit California and Florida, disrupting the supply of fresh vegetables and oranges. Prices would surge temporarily, only to normalize weeks later. Without on-the-ground data, those spikes vanish from the official record. Alternatively, if gasoline prices suddenly dropped due to lower oil demand or an OPEC surprise decision, that too might go unmeasured. The result, the CPI published later might paint a picture of smoother stability when in reality the economy experienced sharp price swings. Policymakers and investors, reading the official numbers, would never know. For housing data, the effect is even more insidious. Because shelter inflation is based on survey rotation, a single missed month in one segment can distort averages for the entire quarter. Housing costs had been one of the main sources of inflation persistence in 2024. And the Fed was watching that component closely. Losing data just when policymakers needed to see if shelter inflation was finally cooling created enormous uncertainty. The BLS could fill some gaps statistically, but the precision simply wasn't there. Now, let's talk about methodology. Under normal circumstances, the BLS has well-defined procedures for handling missing information from individual stores or if a business doesn't provide data in 1 month, the Bureau imputes the missing price using similar establishments in the same area or by applying historic price ratios. That works fine when just a few data points are missing. But the shutdown created something different, a systemic blackout. When nearly all collections stop simultaneously, there's nothing to anchor those imputations. You end up estimating numbers based on models instead of on reality. In short, the CPI report for that period became part science, part guesswork. And that's where the story collides with the world of monetary policy. The Federal Reserve's entire framework revolves around one goal: achieving maximum employment and stable prices. To do that, they monitor inflation indicators obsessively, the CPI among them. Even though the Fed's official target uses a different measure, the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, or PCE, the CPI remains crucial because it arrives first each month and influences everyone's expectations. Markets move the moment the CPI prints. Mortgage rates, bond yields, stock valuations, all react within seconds of the data release. So what happens when those numbers suddenly come with an asterisk? Confusion, volatility, and mistrust. Imagine the Fed sitting in its first policy meeting of 2025. They re-debating whether inflation is finally on track back to 2%. Without clean CPI data, they're guessing. Does the slowdown reflect real moderation or just a gap in measurement? Should they hold rates high longer, risking a recession? Or cut sooner, risking another wave of inflation? When the statistical foundation cracks, even the best policymakers are flying partly blind. The markets felt it too. Traders who rely on CPI trends to price Treasury inflation-protected securities, or TIPS, suddenly faced uncertainty. Hedge funds that build models to forecast inflation volatility had to scrap part of their frameworks. Even small shifts in expectations can cause billions in market adjustments. And all of this because, for a few weeks, the government simply couldn't measure what was happening in the economy. To ordinary citizens, these statistical nuances might seem remote, but their effects are deeply personal. Social Security beneficiaries, for example, receive annual cost of living adjustments based directly on the CPI. Many labor contracts and rent agreements include inflation clauses tied to it. When the index is misstated bent slightly, it shifts real income across millions of people. If inflation is underestimated because price spikes went unrecorded, retirees lose purchasing power. If it's overestimated, it can create artificial pressure for wage increases and contribute to a feedback loop of rising prices. Either way, errors in CPI measurement affect everyone. The shutdown itself became a political flashpoint. Republicans accused the Biden administration of failing to negotiate effectively to prevent it. Democrats countered that the opposition was holding the budget hostage for partisan goals. In the middle of all that, agencies like the BLS, staffed by nonpartisan professionals, found themselves unable to do their jobs. The political fight in Washington became an economic wound for the entire country, and while the public mostly noticed canceled museum visits or federal park closures, the far more consequential damage occurred invisibly, inside the data pipeline. The story I'm about to tell you is one that most people never heard in detail, yet it shaped how the global financial markets began 2025, how the Federal Reserve calculated its moves, and how households across America felt inflation in their wallets. It's a story about missing data, political paralysis, and how something as technical as government statistics can quietly shake the foundation of the world's largest economy. The title that many journalists whispered later was Biden Shutdown Triggered CPI Data Gaps. But what it really means is much deeper. For the first time in decades, the most carefully measured barometer of inflation, the Consumer Price Index, was partially blind. And when the numbers that guide interest rates, wages, and pensions go dark, the consequences ripple everywhere. To understand what happened, we need to start with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or the BLS, one of the quiet backbones of the federal government. Most people never think about it, but nearly every paycheck, every pension adjustment, every policy debate over real wages or inflation depends on the quiet work of those analysts, economists, and field collectors who produce the CPI. Each month, without fail, they gather over 80,000 prices from roughly 23,000 stores and service providers across the nation. They measure what Americans actually pay for food, rent, transportation, healthcare, clothing, and entertainment. The goal is simple: to create a clear, consistent picture of how fast prices are rising across the economy. It's not glamorous, but it's vital. Then came the shutdown. At the dawn of 2025, as debates in Washington stalled and partisan disagreements froze the approval of new spending bills, the federal government went into a shutdown that lasted just long enough to wreak havoc inside the statistical system. For the BLS, that meant one thing: field operations stopped. Data collectors, those hundreds of professionals who go out to stores, gas stations, and apartment complexes to record prices and rents, were legally barred from working. The process of measuring inflation is supposed to be relentless and continuous. But suddenly, the machine went silent. Now, the thing about price data is that it has to be time. You can't rewind the economy. If a grocery store changed the price of eggs on January 5th, and you weren't there to record it, you can't go back 3 weeks later and ask what it was. The manager might not even remember, and there's no price record saved in their system. Everything is ephemeral. Normally, the BLS's collectors visit specific stores at precise intervals to record data on a rotating schedule that ensures consistency. But when the shutdown hit, all those visits were canceled. That means there are gaps, holes in the most important dataset used to measure inflation. And once those gaps exist, they can never fully be filled. The timing could not have been worse. The U.S. economy in early 2025 was in a tense, uncertain moment. After 2 years of aggressive interest rate hikes from the Federal Reserve in its fight against inflation, signs of fatigue had begun to appear. Growth was slowing, but prices in certain sectors, especially housing and services, were still stubborn. There was confusion everywhere. Some economists argued inflation was finally tamed, others warned it was about to flare up again. Investors hung on every data release to guess whether Jerome Powell and the Fed might cut rates soon or keep financial conditions tight for longer. And then, right in the middle of that delicate balance, the lights flickered out on one of the key instruments they rely on. So what exactly went missing? To answer that, we need to look inside the nuts and bolts of CPI calculation. Every month, BLS representatives collect prices for thousands of individual goods and services. That includes basic staples: bread, milk, gasoline, as well as rents, medical care, and child care. Housing alone represents about 1/3 of the total CPI weighting. That's why any interruption in rent data can distort the entire index. The problem is, rent and housing inflation are measured through long-running surveys of tenants and homeowners. Those surveys depend on consistent contact over time. When the shutdown froze those operations, the entire timeline of interviews was disrupted.